Ohio teenager TJ Lane likely faces life in prison after pleading guilty to shooting and killing 3 students in a high school cafeteria last year. Some say serious teen offenders, both those who are mentally ill and those who aren't, have a better chance of rehabilitation than older convicts. If that's true, then how can we best help these young men and women? Here to discuss this is Dr. Alan Ravitz, Senior Director of Forensic Psychiatry at the Child Mind Institute, Paul Boxer, Associate Professor of Psychology at Rutgers University, Patricia Worth, a former Capitol Defense Attorney, and Xavier McElrath-Bey, who was convicted of first-degree murder at 13. Thank you all for joining us. Xavier, I want to start with you. Really a remarkable story. You were convicted of murder at 13. You spent 13 years in prison. Share with us your story, if you will.
I'm basically I grew up in the backyards community of Chicago, roughly in the area of 51st, and my childhood perhaps was typical of most urban youth, being exposed to a lot of gang violence, a lot of drug activities. A lot of even in-home experiences of abuse. Unfortunately, I came from a home that contended with a lot of emotional and physical abusive situations. And I guess as time went by, I became more accustomed to the streets. For some strange reason, I felt safer in the streets because I had my friends, and I was able to get away from the abuse of my stepfather. And just for the most part, it was just a very troublesome childhood, and which led to the streets, and eventually that resulted in multiple arrests as a juvenile. I was in a juvenile detention center on 7 occasions, and by the age of 13 years old, I was already charged, and I eventually pled guilty to first-degree murder.
And so as a result, you spent 4 years in juvenile, and then at 17, you went to an adult prison. Can you talk us through what happened in prison, and maybe you can also share with us, now that you're gainfully employed and you have a master's degree, you really are a success story. And I know that you say that you're not the exception, but what do you think helped bring you to this point?
I mean, it may sound strange, but a lot of people have a misconception about prison and inmates that this is a bunch of diabolical, cold-hearted individuals who are just in there contemplating the next criminal offense. I mean, the fact of the matter is that I was surrounded by a lot of positive individuals, inmates who were there for some time, who had obviously matured and taken on a different perspective on life and were very much of a motivation to me. I was also given the opportunity of meeting some great professors and instructors that embraced me even while I was incarcerated, that gave me a sense of hope and that I could possibly do it someday. And they treat us like any other student out in free society. So I really took that to heart, and it gave me a different sense of purpose, and it made me want to aspire towards better things. In terms of my early childhood experience, of course, as a child, you're still caught up in that sense of invincibility that we all have as kids. We all think for some reason or another that nothing could ever happen to us. And our whole concept of community, of death, of victimization, all these things are so premature that we tend to fall into situations and we make rash decisions because of the impulsive way of living in these environments, that we find ourselves, unfortunately, in a situation of despair too late before we can personally make that change on our own.
Xavier, before we move on and kind of broaden out the discussion, I just want to ask you 2 things. When you say you pled guilty at 13, at the time, did you think maybe you had mental illnesses, based on your upbringing, or do you think you were largely exempt from that?
Well, just to clarify something real fast, I work for the Northwestern Juvenile Project, which is a longitudinal study of youth needs, and also we look at the outcomes of individuals who are formerly incarcerated as youth in the juvenile detention center. And one thing that I could say about my own personal experiences, I've never been diagnosed with any mental health conditions. I've never sought or received any type of treatment while I was incarcerated. I did have a lot of traumatic experiences as a child. But I think that as time went by, I just, I pretty much had to fend for myself in some ways, and I had to just, I guess stoically move beyond those issues in my life in order to succeed. But as far as, for example, the subjects in our study, unfortunately, I've conducted at least 600 interviews, and for the most part, a lot of them endorse mental health issues. In our study alone, after 5 years of follow-ups from the baseline, we look at the prevalence and persistence of psychiatric disorders, and we came to find that 45% of the males and 30% of the females were contended with psychiatric disorders with associated impairments, everything including schizophrenia, mood disorders, anxiety disorders, ADHD, substance use and abuse disorders. And unfortunately, these are things that these kids have to contend with.
So Professor Boxer, when we hear Xavier's story and some of what he just mentioned about the rehabilitation, is prison generally effective as a punishment for young offenders? Do you think it hardens them, or do you think there is a path? Is the justice system set up in a way where they can, in fact, be rehabilitated?
Oh, well, in response to sort of the first part of your question, I would definitely agree that prison is a punishing experience. However, in terms of the kinds of outcomes that you might expect from prison or juvenile detention, I think it really depends a lot on what happens to kids while they're in there. I mean, to some extent, you may have kids go through, as Xavier was describing, with a lot of supportive peers around them, with some good access to services, and those kids can turn out just fine, in fact, maybe even thrive. On the other hand, you may have kids in situations where they're exposed to a lot of violence while they're incarcerated, may not have access to the kinds of services or support they need, and they may end up callous to some extent, or hardened, as you suggest, or distressed in some way as a result of those experiences.
You know, Professor, you mentioned being exposed to a lot of violence. We're talking about potentially being hardened. Xavier, I know that you also say that one thing that's often ignored is that in a correction system, people need to survive. Survive violence and survive in general. So there's not a lot of incentive for education or therapy even, or some of the programs that might help someone like you eventually come out on top.
I mean, basically, a lot of the factors which contribute to a youth's success in terms of moving on past those deviant behaviors have a lot to do with support. Just in there, for example, they have what they call state pay. And the state pay typically is a monthly allowance that is given to inmates, which is issued by the state. And it's, for the most part, well, at the time when I was incarcerated, no more than $10 to $11. This is what every inmate will receive, especially if he remains in the adult basic program, which is provided to most inmates. But after 3 or 4 months, despite your educational level of achievement or whatever goals you may be aspiring towards educationally, you may feel pressured to seek an institutional job, which is simply labor, washing pots and pans, cleaning up trash off the yard. You may have to choose this and not pursue an educational goal, especially if you have no support from the outside world and you're trying to provide for yourself in a world which very obviously has very limited resources.
Patricia, many like Xavier are actually those offenders that you've actually defended, these teens who have been accused of various serious crimes. Do you think our justice system is set up in a way that can actually rehabilitate them?
I don't think that the system is set up in a way that encourages rehabilitation, and I actually commend the young gentleman who was able to achieve so much, I would say, despite prison, not because of prison. I mean, if we look at the defining features of prison, we know that prison is punitive, not rehabilitative. We know that prisons are disintegrative, not reintegrative, so they sever a person's ties to family and community members. We know that prisons are criminogenic in that they foster a maladaptive social environment that really exploits the weaknesses of others, especially young people. We know that it's a structure, we know that prisons encourage a dependence on institutional structures as opposed to the development of your own internal structures. We know that the deprivation, the extreme deprivation and isolation in prisons often lead to a diminished sense of self-worth, and we know that positive self-esteem is very important to a person's successful reintegration into the community and to a person's rehabilitation.
Well, Patricia, I was just going to say, when we talked to Xavier earlier, he said that actually was critical. I mean, he said, referencing some of the other inmates who were positive forces in his life, encouraging him to take certain classes and enroll, and also tutoring each other. So it would make sense, exactly what you're saying.
Exactly. And I think that, and I have heard, there's lots of people who do come out of prison and they actually end up doing well. And it's often because there was a positive adult in the prison who took a positive, genuine interest in that person and encouraged positive things. But the problem is that tends to be the exception, not the rule. And then even when you do have that positive person, we really have abandoned rehabilitative services. So a lot of people don't have access to education in prison. A lot of people don't have access to positive programming in prison. A lot of people don't have access to jobs. Many don't have access to mental health treatment.
So you're saying they're the exception, not the rule. Xavier, you kind of said you aren't the exception. We'll get back to that in a little bit. But Dr. Ravitz, I'm curious, do you agree with Patricia there?
Yeah, I tend to agree with Patricia. I don't think that prison is the best place for kids. A couple of things that I wanted to bring up. First, Xavier, just so you know, I used to work at the Audi home. I used to live in Chicago. I worked for the juvenile court. I did all sorts of assessments of 13-year-old kids who'd committed murder to determine whether or not they should be tried as adults or as children. And I have to tell you that I was like 0 for 100 or whatever. I never thought that a kid should be tried as an adult because there are lots of, I think, good scientific reasons for that. But when we look at children, what we tend to forget, and I think that this is part of your story, part of Xavier's story, is that he did well because he was surrounded by a group of people who provided him with support and encouragement. If you look at the kid, so I have a clinical practice. I've seen several kids who have been incarcerated for some period of time and then have gotten out. The ones who do well are the ones who hook up with mentors or who have very supportive families. You need some kind of support if, in fact, you are... and the other thing that you need to do well, I think, in prison, you need intelligence and you need some physical strength, because otherwise you're just fodder for the real sociopaths who inhabit the prison. You have to be able to stand up to these people. You have to be able to reason with these people, and you have to be able to resist that influence.
And of course, it would help to have mentors. And as you're speaking, Dr. Ravitz, I don't know if you could see, but Xavier, you're actually nodding your head. It seems like that's ringing very true for you.
Yeah, what he's saying is so true, because just listen to you all speak. I'm reflecting upon some of my experiences, and one thing I really want to point out, and we often look at recidivism rates and we talk about the 50 or 60% that often return within the first 3 years after they're released, but we never talk about the 40 to 50% that do not return. And we never look at their lives and try to get perhaps some insight on what they did personally to survive and to be able to make it and to go on to live positive and productive lives. And Doctor, a lot of things that you said really do ring true. I remember when they gave me an evaluation, when they were deciding whether or not to charge me as an adult, and I think that's the only time I actually experienced any type of psychological evaluation. That was based solely for the purpose of determining whether or not I would be charged as an adult. And I can imagine a lot of kids, perhaps because of their experiences and because of their inability to express themselves and open up, and because of that sense of wanting to remain guarded, because of what they've been through. I can imagine that has a lot of effect or a lot of negative impact upon that whole process.
So Doctor, when you hear Xavier talking about this, it does kind of bring to light the question of how you determine whether they should be tried in the first place, and with rates being as high as they are. Your thoughts?
Well, there's a growing body of scientific evidence that brains of teenagers are not as well developed as the brains of adults. If you look at what's called, I'm gonna try to simplify this, but basically there's something called the frontal lobe. That's the front of your brain. That's the part of your brain that allows you to assess things rationally and reasonably. And then you've got all these other parts of the brain that are much more sort of evolutionarily primitive, that have been developed to help us sort of reflexively respond to what we interpret as danger. So what happens is that until people get to be 24 or 25 years of age, the connections to the frontal lobe are really not very well developed. And what happens is that if you offend me, I might think about why you've offended me, and I might try to come up with a bunch of reasons why you've offended me, and I won't think that you're out to kill me. But if my amygdala is the part of the brain that processes that, I'm going to perceive you as a direct threat to me, and I'm going to experience a fight or flight response, and fight is step one. Flight is step two.
Of course. And Xavier, when you hear the doctor talking about this, you said earlier that you felt safer on the streets. I mean, did this kind of thinking, as you're nodding, factor into some of your thinking that led you to feel safer in the streets and to be part of that gang mentality?
For example, just going to Chicago public schools, oftentimes those who create the districts, they pay very little attention to, for example, gang territories. I know we should not bow down to the gangs and perhaps, I guess, map our districts according to their territories on a yearly basis. But unfortunately, these are the things that kids have to contend with. More often than not, I was sent to schools that were, personally speaking, were in rival gang territories. And unfortunately, I found myself in situations where I felt very unsafe just going to school. And at one point, at the age of 12 years old, I literally brought a gun to school. And I was, when they found out, I was arrested, and I served time in the juvenile detention center. But once I was released, very little attention was paid to the reasons why I made that decision. And I ended up being sent to another rival gang territory school, in which case I just chose to drop out altogether.
So I want to kind of take a step back and talk about some of the mental issues here, the health issues in particular. Professor Boxer, you know, we found that, and let me just pull up this stat, the general adolescent population seems to have a rate of about 9 to 20% in terms of the occurrence of diagnosable psychiatric disorders. In comparison, researchers say juvenile offenders have a disproportionately high rate of mental health problems, with estimates saying it could be as high as 70%. How does that factor into any possible, and why do you think the rates are so high? I mean, what is pointing to that, and how do we try and remedy that? Oh, you're unfortunately muted. If you could just unmute yourself in the top right, there's a little microphone button. There you go.
Thanks. That's a very complicated question you ask. I mean, to some extent, when you see kids who are involved in the juvenile justice system who are showing those kinds of high rates of diagnosable mental illness, you start to ask that chicken and egg question of, well, are they showing those kinds of high rates because of where they've ended up, or did part of that psychopathology get them there in the first place? And it's a difficult question to answer. We know that kids who are exposed to a number of different kinds of risk factors for poor social adjustment, violence in their neighborhoods, social disorder and physical disorder in their neighborhoods, and difficulties with their families, etc. Those are risk factors in general for all kinds of different outcomes that are difficult for kids to deal with. So you may have the same kinds of risk factors leading to different kinds of problems. On the one hand, you have juvenile delinquency, and on the other, you have diagnosable mental illness that goes along with that and hand in hand to some extent. So it's difficult to reconcile what came first to an extent. But what we do know, we do know the fact that kids are coming into the system with those kinds of conditions. Mm-hmm. And what we know, on the other hand, along with that, is that we have a lot of effective treatments for those conditions. Some are psychiatric, mm-hmm. some are clinical psychological, some involve social work kinds of interventions or educational. So we have the tools to deal with those conditions, and that's something that's really worth attending to if you're going to talk about rehabilitation in general within the juvenile justice population, is making sure that knowing that kids are coming in with those rates of diagnosable conditions, that the services are in place to help kids cope with them once they're there.
Well, Dr. Ravitz, I'd be curious for your thoughts based on what Professor Boxer said, because I know that you believe that there is a bias, as many do, against mental illness. And perhaps to prove that point, we have Mr. Stoner to you, dude, saying, I believe teen offenders who do not have an underlying serious mental disorder or illness can be rehabilitated. What are your thoughts, Dr. Ravitz?
Well, I think that oversimplifies it. I think that kids with serious mental disorders can also be rehabilitated, and they just need to be treated. I mean, the problem that we have in the United States, I think, is that we have terrible access to mental health care, that people spend much more money on the treatment of, quote, medical, unquote, issues than on psychiatric or psychological issues. If you have a heart attack, you call 911, they send an ambulance. if you have a psychotic episode and you become agitated and you call 911, they send the police. Okay,
right.
So we criminalize mental illness, among other things. And I think, the other thing is that a lot of times inadequately identified and treated mental illness manifests itself as school failure. And if kids fail in school, there are very few other options for them other than if they're no good at being good, maybe they'll be good at being bad. And so what happens is that they move from a kind of pro-social orientation to an anti-social orientation.
Right.
They have concluded that no matter how hard they try, it's just not going to work out. I think that one of the very interesting, this was an older study. You see, I have all this gray hair, so I know about all these older studies. But there was a study that was done in the 70s that looked at reading levels of incarcerated children. And Paul, you may know about more recent data on this, but something like 70% of these kids had learning disabilities of one sort or another. There's a lot of kids who are incarcerated who are perfectly intelligent and they have a great deal of street smarts, but they can't do school because they have their specific kinds of learning problems have not been identified. I think that we have to stop the stigma that's associated with mental illness so that people can get the treatment that they need. The other thing that we need to do is to identify people talk about family values all the time, and I'm cynical about this because we don't really support families in our country. We don't provide them with adequate support, psychosocial.
At least when compared with how much it's often talked about in the political realm or even culturally, I think that's certainly a fair point. But I want to take Dr. Ravitz, if I can, one thing that you talked about, and put it to you, Patricia. He mentioned, we have terrible access to mental health care in this country, and it really does bring to mind other countries and perhaps making some comparisons. Recently, I know you're familiar with the story of the Norwegian prison, and the reason I bring this up is because it has by far the lowest reoffending rate in Europe. And one thing that I thought that was interesting, and I'd love for you to kind of talk about how important this is the prison's run by a clinical psychologist who says you don't have to, you don't change people by power. For the victim of a crime, the offender is in prison, and so that's justice. He says, here I give prisoners respect. This way we teach them to respect others, but we're watching them all the time. It's important that when they're released, they are less likely to commit more crimes. That is justice for society. The reason I bring this up is we've heard from Xavier talking about the importance of having mentors, positive people. Do you think that it's perhaps a lesson for us to learn from the Norwegian system?
Absolutely. I think that the core sort of underlying theory of the Norwegian prison is the sense of community, the sense of helping people know how to interact positively in a community. And so recognizing that prisons don't, the normal prison, a prison like we can think of in the United States, don't foster positive community interaction, the Norwegian prison takes a completely different approach. And to some extent, that's exactly what Xavier's talking about. If he was able to have a sort of micro community, if you will, that was positive in the prison, I think what we want to try to do for our young people, and actually I would encourage this for adults as well, is to try to figure out how can we foster positive community interactions within within any prison. And by that too, you want to help people foster a sense of self-reliance, self-esteem, that they can do positive things and achieve positive things, instead of constantly stigmatizing people as criminals or as bad.
Right, and Xavier, I'm imagining you would agree with that because, one of the quotes also in that article is that if you treat people like animals, as is often how prison life is depicted, even here in this country, they will act like animals, whether in prison or out. When we were talking about some of the mental illness issues, though, especially what Dr. Ravitz was saying, I know that you had met one young Hispanic male who I believe was 14 to 15 who was incarcerated with you. He had psychiatric disorders. Could you share with us his story and what you learned or gleaned from that?
Yeah, looking. Well, first, let me point out one thing that a very important finding. One of the earlier findings of the Northwestern Juvenile Project is that more than 60% of those being taken or being processed into the juvenile detention center had met the diagnostic criteria for one or more psychiatric disorders. This is disproportionately represented. And unfortunately, a lot of these kids are going untreated. They're not receiving the services that are needed. And when they do seek whenever they do provide some type of treatment, unfortunately, it results in a lack of privilege and opportunity for them in terms of other services like education. For example, when I was in IYC, which is the Illinois Youth Center, they had what was called the IRU unit. And IRU unit was the intensive reintegration unit, which really was a separate dorm that contained kids that struggle with past sexual abuse, severe psychiatric disorders, schizophrenia, or either they felt that they were, quote unquote, a victim or more or less a vulnerable individual to the typical general population. And unfortunately, they were held off, and they were always the last to go to the child line. They were always the last ones to go to the yard. They were always the last ones who were able to go to the gym. So, I mean, unfortunately, whenever we have good intentions of helping them and isolating and trying to provide the services, unfortunately, it doesn't seem like the better option because they miss out on other privileges. Going back to the young Hispanic male that I was in the audio home with, that's one thing that stands out so much in my mind because he couldn't have been no more than 14, 15 years old. All I remember is we were all sitting in a day room, and he was banging on his door. He was in segregation. He had committed some type of infraction. He was placed in isolation, and we went to the back and we looked. There was blood coming from underneath his cell door, and little did we know that he tried to commit suicide. Unfortunately, the services that he received, I can imagine, were very minimal because they didn't remove him off the wing. He wasn't sent to the hospital. The officers took him out the cell, made him sit along the wall. They called the nurses. The counselor came in, spoke with him. They allowed him to talk with his mother. And once he calmed down, he was placed back into his cell. So, I mean, I don't think that is far beyond a comprehensive approach in working with these youth. But unfortunately, this is the case. And it really boils down, unfortunately, because the staffs are overwhelmed with a greater population to deal with. It really becomes an issue of just simply whether or not the inmates are behaving well, whether or not they're causing disturbance. And if you're not causing a disturbance, and if you're mumbling to yourself and you're having hallucinations, as long as you're not breaking any rules, you'll be fine. And unfortunately, that is the case in some of these institutions, especially in institutions that are overpopulated and there's very limited amount of programs and services for them.
In New York, mental health treatment in prisons consists of, if you are lucky, you get medication and a 10-minute visit with a mental health staff person once every 2 months. That's not treatment, and that's for the people who are lucky. Xavier's right. They don't even think about trying to do any kind of other more hands-on or more intensive therapeutic intervention until somebody has gotten, has had a serious disciplinary infraction or worse, has tried to hurt him or herself.
And I think that in a way, if you give somebody 10 minutes of mental health treatment every 2 months, it's basically a seduction and an abandonment. You build up hopes and then you dash them, and then people become more cynical about the whole process.
Right. Well, I'm certainly not feeling cynical after speaking with all of you, so I appreciate you all joining us. Dr. Ravitz, Professor Boxer, Patricia over the phone, and Xavier, really a remarkable story. Props to you, man. I wish you the very best.
I agree.
Yes, I think we're all in agreement. I can see the comments. You should go back and check them out, man. Very inspiring story. Much more coming up here at HuffPost Live, as always, so be sure to stay tuned and keep those comments flowing in. Maybe you can even suggest a story if you're feeling bold. Thanks for watching.